Hello. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Brunton from ACFID here in sunny Canberra. So this is a webinar on the ACFID Code of Conduct, annual requirements for annual reporting and financial reporting. So if you are here to learn about something else like gardening or software development or engineering or teaching, you're in the wrong place. But if you're here for an ACFID annual and financial reporting webinar, this is it. Yeah, as mentioned before, my name is Paul Brunton, and there's a photo of me on holidays back in May, riding around in a Pacific island. You can guess which one it is. It's not New Zealand, as you can tell by the way the clothes I'm wearing. Somewhere a lot warmer. If you're having any difficulties with this webinar, any technical difficulties, please contact make contact on the phone number that's there on the slide in front of you. I was going to say, if you can't hear me, check your volume first. If that doesn't work, and you probably won't know because you can't hear me, try the number and hopefully they can sort the problem out. In this webinar, we're talking about, as I mentioned before, the requirements to meet the Code of Conduct around your annual report and financial statements. I'm not covering anything on the compliance self-assessment. I'm also not covering the review of the code at the moment. We're concentrating on the code as it is now, because that's essentially still in place, and that's what you need to use, particularly for the June 30 reporting, annual reports, the ones that close off on the June 30 balance date. So hopefully this will give you a good idea for those of you who are new to this, that what you need to do to meet the Code of Conduct requirements, and for those of you who have done this before, hopefully be a good refresher, and hopefully also cover off on some of the, I suppose, the areas of deficiency that we probably see more commonly. So I'll just backtrack again. Look, I just wanted to set a bit of context first around why we're doing all this. Look, I suppose as a sector, we have a number of goals that we're trying to achieve. So essentially we are seek to be influential agents of change and leaders in development and humanitarian practice in NGO effectiveness and accountability. We improve, and we want to improve, and we want to demonstrate our effectiveness and impact. So we're all about improving practice, keeping the bar, raising the bar, and we're all about establishing, I suppose, well, not establishing, that's the wrong word, ensuring confidence in the sector, of the community, of politicians, of donors, and all other stakeholders. So really, in the context of things, the Code of Conduct is a means to, one of the means to achieve these objectives or these aims. So the expectation is that members of ACFID meet and will exceed the standards set out in the code. When it comes to annual reports and financial statements, I probably like to think of these as essentially, I suppose, vehicles of communication and accountability to members, donors, partners, your staff, stakeholders, regulators, media, researchers, government, and probably anybody else that's interested. And it's really a record of, I suppose, of what happened during the year and maybe a bit of an insight as to what's coming up. The annual reports really provide a permanent record of a point in time and a record that can be relied on by all the users of the report. So essentially, annual reports are really about communication. And they're about you showing transparency, accountability, and doing it in an honest way that tells the story as it is. So if you keep coming back to those sort of principles, that this is about, annual reports are about communication. Financial reports are also about communication, just of your financial situation. If you keep that in mind, that it's about communicating to a whole bunch of stakeholders, then you'll probably go a long way to meeting the requirements of the code without even needing to refer to the rules. I suppose it's always good when you're writing annual reports to think of it from the perspective of somebody who might be reading the report or using the report for some purpose. You know, you're sort of really telling them what you're about, what you've done, how you've done it, how you're travelling financially. And this is essentially what the code covers. Just, I suppose, turning now to the code, there's a couple of main documents. One's the Code of Conduct itself, and the second is the code's implementation guide or good practice toolkit. Now, both of these documents can be found on the ACFID website, and they're pretty much run off the home page for ACFID. If you want to look at the code itself, have a look at the menu, I suppose, bar at the top of the ACFID homepage, and there'll be a tab there called Read the Code, and that'll lead you straight to it. To get into the implementation guide or toolkit, go to the Use the Code tab, and that's also on the top of the homepage. Look, I'll just start off with the code and probably just point out the main areas which you'd need to deal with when doing annual reporting and looking at your financial statements. On this slide, we see C2, which is annual reporting. You'll be able to find that on the toolkit, which will provide, I suppose, more detailed guidance. It's probably the, I suppose, first port of call for anything you want to know about preparing annual reports and the financial statements. So look under the Use the Code tab. There'd be a public engagement section, and that'll be the bit you'd click on. And then to get into annual reporting, under that, you'll find there's a C2 section which covers annual reporting, and that really will cover, I suppose, the basic requirements or the minimum requirements of what's to be included in the annual report. C2.1 covers transparency, which sets out the requirements, I suppose, in what you call the narrative part of the report, which is really the reporting. You set out what your aims and objectives, achievements, the more descriptive part of the report. And C2.2, which is the financial statements, which are actually getting into your finances and income statements and balance sheets and that sort of thing, which we'll talk about a bit later. There is one important element to know about the code and financial statements. The financial statements section in the Good Practice Guide actually does form part of the code. So the requirements around the financial statements in the good practice quote are all mandatory. As I said, essentially do form part of the code, and they're the things that must be complied with for the financial reports to be code compliant. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. There's another section there that you can see, C3, which is about fundraising. And these just set out some of the key things that you need to do to substantiate the use of funds, to show how those funds that you've raised through your fundraising, how they're applied. And really, I suppose the main sort of takeaway in that part is that and how it affects the annual reporting is that need to be honest when reporting fundraising administration costs, especially if showing them in a graphical form or using ratios, because it's often, I suppose, easy at times to maybe even unintentionally give a false impression when using ratios and graphs just by scaling and that sort of thing. So one of the requirements of the code is to explain when using ratios and graphs, just explaining how they're derived, where the figures come from, what's included, what's not included. And again, we'll talk about that a bit further down the track in this webinar. Look, I'll just move on now to some other relevant parts of the code. Section D is all about auditing of financial statements. Again, you can find this in the toolkit, again under D, organisation, and then look under D for financial management. There you'll find a bit about auditing the financial statements. It really is just making sure that for users of the report to be assured that financial statements give a true and fair view of your situation, that they need to be assured by an independent external qualified auditor. And this applies to both financial statements that might be an annual report and your full, I suppose, statutory financial statements if there are something different. Again, I'll cover that in more detail a bit later on because that can be a bit of an area of confusion. Section E, which we also got over there on the right-hand side, is just about the compliance part of the code. This essentially sets out the reporting requirements for compliance self-assessments and annual reporting. Essentially, it says that annual reports and full financial statements have to be lodged within 5 months of the end of your reporting period. So that means for those of you with 30 June balance dates, you've got to the 30th of November to submit your full financial statements and annual reports. Next slide is really just a brief one there. It's just talking about how to get your reporting into us here in ACFID, and we're trying to get everybody onto the compliance portal, which is in My ACFID. If you want to know more about that, as I say, have a look at the My ACFID tab on the home page. If you're not registered, please get in touch and we'll make sure we get you on to that part of the system. And that enables annual reports and financial statements and CSAs to be loaded straight up onto the system, and also facilitates communication through the portal backwards and forwards when we want to give feedback as well. As I say, we're hoping to get everybody up onto that sooner rather than later. I'll get now into a bit more detail about the actual annual reporting process and what's required. So this really just sets out the sort of things we're covering, which is just annual report basics, some information about logos and references. As I mentioned before, a bit of discussion about use of ratios, graphs and statistics. We'll spend a bit of time looking at what's required in financial statements and audit report and governing body declarations. The last couple of points on evaluations and financial summary are there because they are areas that are required by the code, but probably more often than not are omitted from annual reporting. So that's an area we're trying to focus on to make sure people don't forget it. So I'll try and give as much information as I can about what those items are meant to cover, and I'll cover that as part of the annual report basics. So, as I said before, the transparency part that we're talking about of the code and the reporting requirements really covers what we call the narrative part requirements of reporting, which is the non-financial side, I suppose, the more descriptive side. So, what's required there? First up is a description of your purpose, objectives, aims and values. Now most of you probably would have that up on your website, and pretty much just about every annual report that I've seen since I've been here, there's no problem with that part of it. So that's really just setting out what your organisation's on about and how it operates, and particularly around values as well. Usually not a problem. The second element there, number B, is a plain language summary of your income and expenditure and overall financial health over the year. As I mentioned before, this is an area that more often than not that's missing from annual reports. And essentially, it's about putting your what's in your financial statements into words or into charts, or however you might want to present it, I suppose. But it's really giving the story about your financial performance and health in a way that's not through the financial accounts, but it's telling the same story. I suppose I'd like to think of it in the way that if you had to explain your organisation's finances over the year to someone at a barbecue or at a dinner party or at the water cooler or whatever it may be, you do it in the same way here in this part of the annual report. It doesn't have to be lengthy. For example, you could just say the organisation over the year made a surplus. That surplus will be used, put into reserves to, as a contingency for future projects, or it might be to, address possible changes in foreign exchange or whatever the case may be. Or it could be the organisation's made a deficit for the year, and then you might want to tell the story about how that deficit will be addressed, whether it's through cutting back programs, it might be through drawing on reserves, it might lead to increased focus on fundraising next year. But that's the sort of thing that I suppose you could include in this part of the annual report. Also, you might, a number of annual reports also use this area to sort of graphically or in words explain where the funds have come from the year and where they went. So it might be they've had a grant or a big fundraising event which produced a lot of funds, and they were dispersed this way and that way and applied to various purposes of projects. Again, it's don't actually. not that directive about what's in here, but it's just an area that needs to be there just to tell your financial story. And in the toolkit, you'll find under the transparency tab, there's a bit of some guidance and some practical help around the sort of things that you can put into this part of the annual report and the financial plain language financial summary. And as you'll see from that, there's quite a bit of got quite a bit of room to work with. You know, some people might put in an historical picture about how their finances have changed over the years and where they've got to now, and how the sources of funding have changed over time, and where that, you know, where their funding focuses have shifted to. It's up to you, but it's really just telling the story, and also trying to give the readers of the report, I suppose, some confidence in the financial security of the organisation, that you are financially sound. Well, hopefully you are. And I suppose if you're not financially sound, then you know what steps you're going to take to address that. So hopefully that's given some idea of what the sort of thing that's required in that part of the annual report. Number C, there's just talking about another reporting requirement, which is just listing out the significant aid and development activities. Again, this is usually just about always present in every annual report, so it's really basically saying what are the main things you did over the year. Probably the thing just to mention is that to make sure that that section also covers the impacts of what you've done. You know, it could be you've got X amount of children into school or into education that weren't there before. Could be people have, you know, got improved access to water. Could be people have, you know, got increased access to medical facilities. For people in advocacy, it could be that they've had input into government policy, and that's resulted in some sort of change to policy, or at least to some sort of change in attitude to government, or the government's attitude to a matter. So it's really about trying to put in the so what's around your activity as well. So a lot of organisation reports list all the activities, but there's sort of not the so what. What did that achieve? What was the impact of that? So that's something that to look out for there, to try and include that sort of content. Number D is about evaluations, and in particular about learnings coming out of evaluations into effectiveness, and how you put those learnings into practice. Again, I'd have to say this is an area that more often than not that isn't covered in annual reports. And when it is covered, it's often about process. So people will describe that will say, yes, we do have an evaluation process, and here it is. We do this and we do that, but it doesn't actually tell you what. It doesn't provide any content and doesn't actually set out what the outcomes from the evaluation process was, and what was learnt as a result, and what was changed. So really, we really are looking for those things. Did you run an evaluation? Look, you might not have, and maybe maybe you just had some feedback during the year about some of your programs informally, or maybe something's just come up through routine monitoring. But I think any learnings that you might have captured of any particular program, any part of the operation, that's what we're looking for, is that's recognised, reported on, and what you've done with those learnings, what you might have changed around a project, around your operations. And this is all about demonstrating to readers of the report that your organisation's seeking to improve, that it's continuously seeking to learn, improve its effectiveness, improve its impact, improve its programs. Could be, you know, it could be anything. Could be maybe end up addressing capability gaps. Could be you might change the structure of your operations. Could be direct into, you know, you've changed what you do in a particular program. And we don't expect you to evaluate or even act on every facet of what you do every year. It may be just on a particular program or project, one part of the activity that you've learned some lessons that you can report on. The other element there is just a report by the management or governing body. Again, every annual report tends to have a report by the CEO or chair or board of directors, and usually haven't seen any difficulty with that in the past. I post those up to them, I suppose, but normally they give a bit of a rundown of key events during the year and any other thing that they might see fit, which can be all about anything from changes to personnel to changes in government policy or whatever they choose to talk about. But usually gives a bit of an overview of their operation and how they think they've gone as a CEO or chair of the board. Moving on to the next slide. This one just covers logos and just occasionally, next slide. This one just covers logos and just occasionally you see annual reports that are using ACFID logos, and there's no requirement that you have to use an ACFID logo, but a lot of, I suppose a lot of the members like showing that they're a member of ACFID and what that means. So the top logo there is the current ACFID logo and the one that's in use at the moment and should be used in annual reports. The bottom ones we sometimes see, and they're old logos that are no longer in use. So that's, again, another thing to look out for, and often I think people just sort of roll things over from one year to the other, and these sort of things slip through sometimes. You can get information about ACFID branding and the ACFID logo off our website. To get that, just go onto the home page, have a look under the About ACFID tab, and under that tab there should be an ACFID section, and then just look at using our logo and branding. Or you can just go on the home page and search for logo, and you should come up with the result, which takes you to the section there that just talks about logo, and you can just sort of pull the copy the logo off there if you need to. Just move on. So I'm just note I'm getting a couple of questions coming up here. I'll stop shortly and just after get through the narrative section of the reporting, and I'll try and address some of those. So I'll have a bit of a break while I'll try and grapple with some of the questions that have come in. The other part, I suppose, the narrative reporting, I suppose the things that are specific references, which are again around, I suppose, showing your organisation's commitment to the code as a member of ACFID. And there's a statement that's required to go in the annual report, and the wording's up there on the up on the slide, which is basically saying that you're a signatory to the code of conduct, and as a signatory, you're committed and fully adhere to the code, and essentially are transparent, accountable, and operate with integrity. Now we see various, I suppose, versions of that statement, and some probably a bit weak, I suppose, for our liking. Sometimes people just say, look, we're a member of ACFID and a signatory to the code of conduct, full stop. But I suppose we really are looking for that statement of commitment as well. That's in the second part of that statement. So if you use sort of words similar to what we've got there, you can't really go too wrong. There are a couple other requirements too, just around putting information about complaints in the annual report. And again, occasionally we see these not being in the annual report, and often they're usually up on the website, and just a case of really just using the same words. But the requirements are you need to identify the ability for someone to lodge a complaint against your organisation. You also need to identify the ability for someone to lodge a complaint against the ACFID Code of Conduct, and then put in the relevant contact details back to ACFID for them to do that. And again, there's some wording up there in that slide, and if you use that, you can't really go too far wrong if you use words along that nature. With these requirements in this slide too, I suppose what we see in a lot of annual reports, they're usually grouped up in one spot, typically with the ACFID logo. So you must have a little sort of ACFID compliance sort of statement section, and that's usually, I suppose, it can be considered good practice to do it that way. Then it's clear that those statements are there and everybody can see them and are visible and not so buried away in parts of the report. Again, all this is really just about transparency and accountability, as we talked about earlier before. Ratios and graphs and statistics. So in some annual reports, we see the use of charts of financial ratios, particularly around fundraising costs and admin costs and those sort of overheads, to show what percentage they are of, I suppose, of money that's dispersed. So obviously it's trying to prove usually that those costs are kept to a minimum, and that most of the money that's collected by the organisation goes direct into aid and development programs. Sometimes looking can be a good practice to show a time series. We see that often happen, where people can show some organisations can show an improvement over time, over a period of years, that those ratios for fundraising and administration are coming down. There's no requirement for you to be able to put in charts and ratios at all. That's up to you and how you want to present your reports. But the important part is when you do, that you do show them in an honest and transparent way, in a way that doesn't, I suppose, seek to make things look a little bit rosier than what they may be. I suppose for anyone who's a statistician, you know that there's always ways you can present things that, I suppose, make things look a bit better than what the picture is. So for that reason, the code does require, when you use charts and ratios to explain administration and fundraising costs, that those charts and ratios are accompanied by notes to show how those how the underlying figures used to construct those charts and ratios, where they came from. And look, that could be just simple as these figures came direct out of the financial statements, so they're just a transformation of what's in the financial statements into a different form. Or it may be that you might have to say that fundraising costs include these items, but don't include these items. So it's just clear to the reader what they're looking at. So again, it's just really being about transparent around all that, around those sort of use of those sort of charts and ratios. And again, I probably have to say that more often than not, when there are charts and ratios, they aren't accompanied by those explanations and notes. So that's another thing that we tend to have to go back to members about that are writing annual reports to get them to fix up. I suppose the other reason I've got here too for the accurate disclosure of fundraising costs, apart from telling the story of whether they're getting better or not, but it's actually just to show donors and the wider community, government, whoever it may be, that it's actually necessary to include such costs, and that not every dollar can go direct to an aid and development program, that actually you've got to run an organisation, that you've actually to obtain funds just about always will encompass some expenditure. So there is a wider sort of purpose in trying to communicate, trying to educate the community about that, because there's always pressure, I suppose, that the people always like to see their money go directly to a program. I'll just take a, excuse me for a sec, I'll just take a quick break to take a bit of water while my croaky voice is sort of, hopefully will hold out. And look, I've got a number of questions here about getting access to slides. So this presentation will be up on the ACFID YouTube channel sometime after this webinar is finished. So that will be available, and also a recording of the whole webinar as well. And I think that's about the only questions people have got. If anyone's got any burning questions, just type them up there in the text box, and I'll keep my eye on that and see if I can address them as we go through. And any questions I can't address, look, I can certainly happy to deal with them after the webinar. And also, if you think of things after the webinar that I might not have covered or may not be clear, or just the fact that you've had a chance to think about things, just get in touch with me by email or phone. No problem. Yep, someone's asked who's the best contact in ACFID if we want to check anything. Look, my details will be on this at the end of the webinar, so feel free to contact me. And a few people have asked that. And Katrina's asked me some questions about core funding that covers the cost of public fundraising, and how that's addressed in the cost of public fundraising. I might talk to you a bit more about that one offline, Katrina, if you don't mind, because I'm probably need to understand the question a bit more than maybe we can do on the just here on the just doing it by text. Just actually looking for see your details up here. Actually, Katrina, if you could just shoot us your phone number or email address, that'd be good, and that'll allow me to get in touch with you. We can have a bit of a discussion about that. All right, I'll keep moving along. Oh, who am I? Someone's asked. My name's Paul Brunton. I'm the Code of Conduct Officer in ACFID. And I probably didn't say this, I've been in this job mainly since about probably April, May. I took over from Joe D'Angelo, who some of you might have dealt with in the past. And I've actually got the same phone number as Joe, which is 02 6281 9234. Look, I'll keep moving on for now. So we've pretty much dealt with the narrative part of the report, or the written part of the report. Now for the fun part, which is all about the financial statements. So as I mentioned before, the code requires financial statements to be included as part of the annual report. And this is all about enhancing transparency through facilitating fair and consistent disclosure of the financial situation. And the code actually sets out mandatory minimum requirements, reporting requirements around financial statements. And again, this is not only just for transparency, but also as for comparability. So it means that somebody who's reading the report, if they're so interested, can compare what's in your financial statements with the financial statements of another member, or they might want to just go back in time and look at any shifts during the years. So that requires some consistency in reporting as well. And again, that's another reason for setting out some, I suppose, mandatory minimum reporting requirements around finances. Now, I've often seen a bit of confusion around financial statements and what needs to go in the annual report. So what has to go in the annual reports are, I suppose, what we call the code compliant financial statements, the ones that meet the requirements of the code. And that will be something less than your full statutory financial statements that you might have to do for other purposes of other regulators. So they can be two different things. And often seen cases where the full financial statements are and can be included in the annual report, but they may not be code compliant. Or sometimes where financial statements that are code compliant are produced as a separate document outside of the annual report. But for the annual report to be compliant with the code, those code compliant financial statements must be in the annual report. Full audited financial statements, as I say, can be something different, and they can be produced separately. But as I say, if those full audited financial statements are code compliant, they can also just be put straight in the annual report if you wish, and that would satisfy requirements as well. As I say, there's often a bit of confusion where we get one not quite the right document in the right place. So that's something to look out for, that you've got the code compliant annual financial statements in the annual report itself, and not as a separate document. As I said too, the code compliant financial statements, they are can be something less than the full financial statements. And as you'll see from, we get a bit more into this, they tend to focus more on international aid and development activity, obviously because that's what ACFID and the Code of Conduct are all about. Whereas your full financial statements may also cover a whole lot of other activity as well, should you be involved in domestic programs or other operations that beyond that. So the code itself provides a couple of different options for reporting depending on the size, well, roughly depending on the size of your organisation. Option one is for organisations that have international aid and development revenue of less than $250,000 during the reporting period. So typically for smaller organisations. However, it can also apply to larger organisations who might undertake a range of activity. They could run domestic programs or I suppose other enterprises, and international aid and development activity is only a small part of their operation, and that again, that's meets that $250,000 threshold. So you can be a large organisation and get option one if you have just a small amount of international aid and development revenue. So you might guess, given threshold, that the option one is probably a less rigorous, or a less, I suppose rigorous is not the word I should be using, is it? A less, I suppose, less costly and easier, shorter sort of method of reporting, mainly just to recognise the fact that it's not a, you know, the operations are smaller, and would typically, this would typically apply to smaller operations. So what's required is a short form income statement, a table of cash movements for designated purposes, and a audit report on those financial statements. Also, what's required, if I suppose summary financial statements and not the full financial statements are included in the annual report, as a reference to say that full financial statements can be obtained from somebody, usually by application to somebody in the organisation, or they can be downloaded from a website somewhere else, or whatever the case may be. But it's important that that readers of the report who want to look at the full financial statements know where to find them. Should also say, with these options, if you're a bit unsure which option to applies to you, that there is a flowchart in the Good Practice Guide in the financial management, in the financial reporting section. That'll be under public engagement, annual reporting, and then you'll see a financial reporting section. If you look into that, there'll be a link to a flowchart which will just set out which option, help you determine which option applies to you, and then that will then set out what the reporting requirements are around that option as well. So for option one, for those of you who are that would apply to, this is essentially the minimum amount of information that you need to put in your income statement, or statement of comprehensive income, or whatever it is you might want to call it, but that's what's required. Yeah, quite free to add extra items. So this sets out a minimum standard. If you want to add more to that, that's up to you. But they're the items that we'd be looking for. An important thing to remember here too is that we require each of those items to be reported on or disclosed, even if there's no transactions against any of those items during the year. So you might have a nil balance. If you do have a nil balance, the ways to deal with that are just record that as nil in the income statement, or alternatively, you can take it out of the main body of the income statement and include a note which lists all the items that have nil balances. That will be a satisfactory disclosure of those items as well. But it's got to be transparent that those items have don't have a balance one way or the other. And unfortunately, that's an area we probably quite frequently see problems with, that some of the items are missing from the income statement or from the other reporting, and they're not covered by a note as well. And I think it's probably important to realise. I know a bit of feedback from some members too is that, you know, they sort of take items out because you're trying to get things on the one page in the annual report, or where printing's involved. You know, sometimes to print an extra page means you've got to print 4 and extra costs and all that sort of stuff. So things do tend to get truncated, and space becomes a premium. But when it comes to these things, these items have to be there. So hopefully that's reasonably straightforward, that those items need to be reported against in the income statement under option 1. The other document that's required is a table of cash movements for designated purposes. Now there's a, that is required where you have a, some fundraising or raising some cash for a purpose, whether it's a program or a project or whatever it may be, an appeal, that generates 10% or more of the organisations of your international aid and development revenue for the financial year. So if you don't have one of those, you don't have to do a table of cash movement for designated purposes. But what you do need to do is a note that says that you didn't have a single appeal or grant or other form of fundraising that meets that 10% threshold. And there's some words to that extent up on the slide. Someone asked where they find the toolkit. The toolkit's up on the ACFID website, so if you go to the home page and go to use the code, and that'll get you into the toolkit. So this next slide here basically shows you what's in a table of cash movements for designated purposes. So it's essentially just tracking the flow of cash and how that's used for each designated purpose through the year. So basically what balance at the start, cash raised, cash dispersed, balance at the end. An important thing to remember is the total balance at the end, which is the red box in the bottom right-hand corner, must agree, box in the bottom right-hand corner, must agree with the cash assets line in your balance sheet. Having said that, in option 1, you're not required to produce the balance sheet, not for ACFID purposes anyway, but probably should agree with the cash assets line in your full financial statements. Sometimes it won't, because you'll have cash raised and dispersed for other purposes that are not designated purposes. And sometimes that might be for domestic programs. That could be just we've seen things like petty cash, for instance. Throw this out. As I say, sometimes just cash used for various other purposes. So there is a line there, the third line down in this example, which is total for other non-designated purposes. So that's sort of your balancing line to make sure that your total in this document equals your cash assets, or cash and cash equivalents line in your balance sheet. Again, that's sometimes an area that does get missed, and that we have to go back to people about. And as I say, it's usually just because there's some other element of cash that hasn't been taken into account. Option 2, that applies to organisations, that have a international aid and development revenue of $250,000 or more. So we ask a bit more from you, essentially. The income statements, a bit longer, and there's a few more headings to report against. We also ask for a table of cash movements against designated purposes, same as for option 1. We also ask for a balance sheet or statement of financial position, or whatever you may call it in your organisation. For those of you who are companies, who are trusts that have companies as a trustee, we ask for a statement of changes in equity. So readers can see the flow of funds during the year in and out of reserves, and impact of surpluses and deficits and that sort of thing. And again, we required an audit report on the actual financial statements that do go into the annual report. So if they're summary financial statements, not the full financial statements, we also need an audit report in the annual report on those summary financial statements. And again, similar to option 1, if full financial statements aren't in the annual report itself, there needs to be a reference as to how to get hold of those full financial statements to the reader. This is the option 2 income statement. As you can see, it's a bit longer than the option 1 income statement, so there's a few more categories that we require disclosure against. Again, same principles apply. All of those need to be disclosed for the income statement to be code compliant. If there's zero balances, you can either disclose them as with a zero balance in the actual income statement, or they can be covered off in a note to the income statement, where you might list all the items that have zero balances, whichever is easier. As I mentioned, the extra requirement here is also to include a balance sheet or statement of financial position. And I'm sorry, this slide is not as clear as I thought it might be. I should say there's templates for all of these income statements, balance sheets, statement of equity, table of cash movements. There's templates for all of those under the in the good practice guide or the toolkit. Again, in the same place under public engagement, annual reporting, and in the financial statement section of that, you'll see links to these templates. And I suppose, see, a number of organisations just tend to use in the annual reports, just tend to use these headings as a way of making sure they comply. So from doubt, I suppose that's something you can consider doing. Again, same principles apply here. All these items have to be disclosed. If there's nil balances, you can either disclose zero balance, or you can include a note to say that the particular items have zero balances. Either way, but again, they've got to be in there one way or another. Statement of changes in equity. As I say, this is for those organisations that are companies or trusts that have a company as a trustee, typically. And again, the flow chart, the option 1, option 2 flow chart, also will show for what particular entities what sort of reporting is required. And again, this template can be found in the toolkit. This one doesn't have to be slavishly followed. There's a bit more flexibility around this, but we'd probably be looking for the same elements, but it might be just using whatever format suits your organisation the best. And as I say, there's more guidance in the toolkit about this, but this is what typically a statement of changes in equity would look like. As I say, it's really just tracking the movement around retained earnings, reserves, and the equity part, I suppose, of the balance sheet and what's going in, what's going out. Sorry, just bear with me for a sec. I'm just catching up with my notes here. As mentioned before too, sorry, I'll just go back. A table of cash movements for designated purposes is also required to be reported for option 2 or produced for option 2. Again, it's subject to that same 10% rule, where if you have a cash raised for designated purposes, exceeds 10%, or I think it's 10% more of your international aid and development revenue, then you need to do a table for cash movements for designated purposes. And again, if you are under that threshold, you need to put in a note explaining that that's not the case. Audit reports and governing body declarations. Audit reports is another area where we sometimes see a bit of confusion about. As I mentioned before, there needs to be an audit report in the annual report, and that audit report must cover the financial statements that are produced in the annual report. So if you're just doing code compliant, I suppose, summarised financial statements annual report, you need to have an annual report that covers just those code compliant statements. So for some of you, it may mean that you need 2 audit reports, one to cover the financial statements that are in your annual report, that may be something less than your full financial statements, and then you'll also need an audit report covering your full financial statements as well. As I say, there's sometimes you see a bit of confusion around that. Sometimes we see financial statements included in the annual report, but no audit report. But the audit report's got to be there. That's a mandatory item. With the audit reports themselves too, there's a few requirements around that. One of those is we need to see in the audit report the identity, the qualifications and contact details of the auditor. The contact could be, includes things like the firm name, address, telephone, email, website, etc. The sort of stuff that you normally find in the letterhead. And I've suppose found a few cases where that's not present. Typically, I think what happens too is the audit reports tend to be scanned into the annual report, and then to save space, often I think some bits are cropped off, and often it's those bits that are lost. So it's just something to watch out for, that when you are scanning an audit report into the annual report, that information is retained and not lost somewhere. Someone's asked me a question, where we have a company as a trustee and a trust, can you show these combined? Yes, you can. I think I've seen just about every combination of stuff where people show produce separate reports, one for each entity. So if you're an organisation that might be made up of several different funds, because you might have separate funds for separate purposes, or you might have a DGR fund and one that's not DGR, whatever the case may be, or you might have a company trust that you might separately report. Some organisations will report all those separately and produce separate and put those in the annual report. Others will produce a consolidated report and I suppose run them all together. It's really up to you. Also seen cases where they do both. They produce them separately and also produce a consolidated report as well. As I say, I think any format there is fine, and it's really just up to what's easiest for you. But as long as you meet these requirements and whatever combination you're doing that, then that's fine. Hopefully that answers the question, but let me know if it doesn't. Right, thank you. That's did that answer the question? Okay. Governing body declaration. So we require a declaration from the governing body, and this is typically the words that are used on this slide. That's got to come to ACFID, but it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the annual report. I suppose most annual reports do include this as part of their financial statements, but doesn't have to be there if you don't need it to be there. If it's not, typically what would happen is that, and typically these, sorry, I'll go back a step. Typically this sort of declaration would form part of the full statutory financial statements. So normally what would happen is if you haven't included it in the annual report, people just send in their full financial statements to ACFID, which includes a statement, which is quite acceptable. But that's certainly got an item that's got to be present and got to be reported to ACFID, even if it's not part of the annual report itself. Now, to make things a bit easier, because if you're confused about all what I've just said, which I wouldn't be surprised if you are, there's a pretty good summary, a checklist that we've got on the website, which summarises all the requirements, which you can then just use to basically check off what's appropriate for your organisation to make sure you've covered everything. Later on, towards the end of this presentation, there is a slide with a number of sort of web addresses, and one of them is to the checklist, so you should be able to just hopefully copy that out of your out of the presentation or write it down or whatever, and wake it into your browser, and that should get you to the checklist. But it's also there as part of the toolkit as well. So I did try to put all these links into this presentation, but then found out they wouldn't work. They're not live links, so unfortunately that I failed on that one. Well, that one's just going to make life easier. Yep, just another question about the slides. All the slides will be, this whole webinar will be recorded and the slides will be put up on the website. I think it'll be initially on the ACFID YouTube channel, which will replay the webinar, and the slides will be available there as well. Someone's asked me what are the main changes in reporting requirements from June last year. None, I don't think. I think pretty much the same. I think any changes you'll see will be part of the code review, which is won't impact you right away, and I'll touch on that towards the end of the this presentation. But there's another webinar on that next week to go through that in more detail as that's going through a consultation phase. Normally, I think most changes I see in annual reports, just to sort of carry on from that question, are typically where we might have looked at something 2 or 3 years ago and given the thumbs up and said that annual report's complied. And then over the next couple of years, whether it's a graphic designer or somebody's come in and they've changed something, or they've decided the bit wasn't necessary or something like that, and then we find there's a bit, one of the bits that make the annual report code compliant has been removed for some reason, and then it's not, you know, despite it being okay a couple of years ago. So that's sort of something to watch. I think, again, I think that's all sort of usually tied up in report design and saving space or making room for other things and that sort of thing. So really it's just making sure that the elements that are required to make you annual report code compliant remain to be there, even though people might change the format of your reporting. Oops, so I'll just get through that. Look, this is really covering off on a number of definitions. So you'll see in the code and also in the Good Practice Guide Toolkit, there's a section F, which is around definitions, and there's a whole bunch of financial definitions, which will include things like what fundraising expenses, what goes to administration, non-monetary expenditure. Now that just might be handy when you're preparing your reporting and you need to allocate items and you're not too sure. That'll be a first port of call to have a look at those to see if they help you. Probably a few things to note around these is that if you have non-monetary expenditure, typically maybe say to recognise volunteer contributions or something like that, or sorry, non-monetary, I said expenditure there, non-monetary revenue, then you must have non-monetary expenditure to offset that amount. I think that's really there just to make sure that any non-monetary, I suppose, don't know if revenue is the right word, or contribution or whatever it may be, doesn't then look to distort the financial position, you know, to make something that might be a deficit into a surplus or something like that. So that's why there's always got to be that the non-monetary revenue's got to be always offset by the same amount of non-monetary expenditure. And a couple of other more important definitions are just around things like international and political or religious adherence promotion. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. It's time of the webinar. It's really just making sure that, you know, there's separation between aid and development activity and other activity, really. So you see that in the definition. So it's just to make sure that all that's delineated, particularly for organisations that might be, you know, doing missionary work overseas. That's not so much aid, but more, you know, religious promotion and that sort of thing, to make sure that's recognised as something different. As I said before, it's at the start, ACFID in the Code of Conduct is all about international aid and development, not about other type things. Yes, just another question. Yes, I'm just asked to say that the non-monetary income and expenditure need to match, and yes, the answer to that is yes. So they should offset each other. You end up with cancel each other out. And as I said before, that's just to, I think, to prevent distortions in the financial picture, I suppose. Fundraising, again, is another important area or another important definition. You'll see that in the income statements, fundraising is a mandatory item to report against. Sometimes we see that fundraising is absent. That maybe sometimes it's called something else or wrapped up in some other expenditure. People might wrap it up in the admin. Sometimes they might just say, call it a different name. But we should appear be disclosed under the fundraising item in the income statement. And I suppose as a general rule where we see organisations undertaking fundraising, that we'd expect really to see some sort of fundraising expenditure disclosed. Now, if for some reason you haven't incurred any fundraising expenditure during the year, I think it's good practice to put in the note to explain why there was no fundraising expenditure, to make it transparent to the reader that that's the case, and maybe a bit of an explanation why. It could be just because you've got a 3-year grant and that just continues on and you don't need to do anything apart from spend the money or whatever it is that year. But that's just an important area to note, that fundraising should always be present in the income statement, or fundraising costs should be recognised, and that there should always be a reason provided if there aren't any. And ditto for, excuse me, ditto for accountability and administration costs as well. Again, we'd expect organisations to have some sort of accountability administration costs just to operate and survive. And that provides some examples of the sort of things that go in under that item. They're typically items that can't be directly allocated to a particular program or project. As again, it's sort of, we'd expect to see some sort of accounting and administration cost disclosed in the income statement. Is part and parcel of a normal operation. Probably you can expect us, if that's a zero balance and there's sort of no explanation, you probably could expect us to come ask a question to get a bit of understanding why that might be the case. I'll just take just another brief break for a sec, mainly just to lubricate my throat. As you can tell, my voice is starting to get a bit scratchy. Excuse me for a sec. Sorry about that. Just having a quick scroll of the questions. Anybody get anything else? I've pretty much covered the financial statements part. So if anyone's got anything else they want to ask right now, quite happy to hear it and see if we can cover it off. All right, I'll keep moving on. This slide here is just really around the annual reporting process, including compliance self-assessments as well. Look, essentially, once your reports are submitted on time, and if you are having difficulty making the 5-month deadline, please get in touch with us so we know what's going on, and that probably saves us you getting an email from us chasing you up. And also, if you need more time, just let us know and we'll consider it. Usually we're pretty flexible about those sort of things if the requests are reasonable. So once we assess pretty much annual reports and on a 3-year basis, so normally we would assess new registrants a year after they've started with us. And initially we do a review year 1, which is just probably a bit of a look over their annual reporting and to suggest improvements that may need to be made into the future. And that might be followed up with to suggest improvements that may need to be made into the future. And that might be followed up with a full-blown assessment the next year. For everybody else, we usually operate on a 3-year cycle. So everybody's got to be looked at once every 3 years. So if you are on the list to be looked at, you're assessed in detail. And we do find things wrong with the annual report. Initially we'll get in touch, and if there are things that need to be fixed for the actual current annual report, we'll ask you to fix them, and that could be usually involves making changes to what's up on the website rather than printed documents or anything like that. We also might make suggestions on lesser matters for future years, and how to enhance and improve things as well. So that's essentially the sort of process that happens for those of you that haven't been involved. So I've got a couple of slides here that are just more about some of the, I suppose, areas that we often see that need to be rectified. First one's about if you have been reviewed recently or been assessed in the past and you did get some advice to fix things up or improve things or do something, yeah, please make sure you do it, because we do refer back to what was said in the past. We will look to make sure that anything that might have been deficient in past reports and advised to you has been rectified. Yeah, one is just make sure we apply financial definitions as they're in Part F and they're for the reasons that I was just talking about before. Just make sure that things are correctly captured and reported. And normally, you know, your accounts have been audited, so usually the stuff's pretty good. As I say, it's usually where things are missing or zero balances, we'd expect not to be a zero balance, that we might have a few questions in particular. Yeah, make sure that, again, harking back to the templates for the various financial documents, income statement, balance sheet, table of cash movements, etc. Yeah, just make sure that you cover off all the headings in those documents that apply to you, whether you're option 1 or option 2, either in the financial statement itself or as a note if you've got a zero balance. But yeah, just make sure they're covered. As I say, quite often they're not. Again, submission within 5 months of the end of the reporting period. Just cover that before. If you're running late, you're having problems meeting that, yeah, please get in touch. Again, financial statements code compliant financial statements must be in the annual report. They must be one and the same document, and they must have an audit report as well. So that's a very important one to make sure you cover off. As I say, there's cases where annual financial statements haven't been in annual reports, and that it's much more difficult to fix them after the event than it is beforehand. Make sure if you do have a table, you do meet that 10% test around raising cash for designated purposes, that you do include a table of cash movements, and that the closing balance does reconcile back to the cash and cash equivalents. As I said before, that's usually because there's other non-designated cash raised for other purposes that needs to be recognised in that table of cash movements. Yeah, make sure you've got your statement of commitment to full adherence to the code. And yeah, please make sure it is a statement of commitment rather than just a statement of membership of ACFID or something lesser. Yeah, make sure you've got the complaint statements in there. As I say, often every now and then we see them not being there, or one being there and not the other. Yeah, make sure we get the governing body declaration. As I say, that's would usually be in your full statutory financial statements. So if it's not an annual report, yeah, make sure you send us the full set of financial statements as well, which actually you're required to anyway. So not usually a problem, but sometimes we don't get it. As I say, plain language financial summary, as we discussed earlier, that's one that's is quite often missing. And yeah, just making sure you've got that sort of narrative summary of your financials in there. And it doesn't have to be long. Might only need to be a paragraph or two, depending on how complicated your situation is or not. And the information and evaluations, as I say, that's one that's often missing, particularly from that outcome perspective about what you've learnt and what you've done with those learnings. And these again are just more of the same of the most common non-compliance issues. As I say, that they've probably been fairly consistent over the last year or so. This slide just talks about a couple of the, I suppose, groups that work in the financial annual reporting area, Financial Review Standing Committee, and the Finance Community of Practice, which might be relevant to some of you. So yes, certainly, you know, finance community practice is certainly one that might be worth considering in particular, particularly if, as a way of getting advice, getting questions answered by other members that might be going through the same thing that you are. Again, just some final issues here around, as I mentioned before, if you're going to be late lodging reports, yeah, let us know ASAP, or with any other issues that you got around them too. Should also say that, if you've got any questions around financial reporting as you're preparing them, certainly the toolkit, use that as your first port of call. If that's not answering your question, yeah, please get in touch and we'll see what we can do. As I said here, just the same thing, make sure any outstanding non-compliance issues have been addressed. Got my contact details down there at the bottom. I think the next thing I just really wanted to touch on before we go was just the code review. As some of you might know, the code is currently under review at the moment. A consultation draft is out now with membership. Slide after this will have just a web address if you want to get hold of the code and have a look at it. There's a webinar on the revised code next week if you want to know more about it. I suppose in general the code's looking at rationalising a lot of the obligations and rules and trying to make things a bit simpler. Aiming for ratification of the code by the ACFID board in September, and it'll commence from the first quarter of 2017. Practically what that actually means really is that annual reports that they've got a June 30 balance of this year are still under the old code, as will be the ones with a December 31 balance this year as well. So there won't be any change for a little while. And over the next, as part of the implementation of all this, over the next 3 years, there's a bit of a transition period, and we'll be working with all of you to make sure that you certainly understand anything that might change as a result of the code review, and work on with you, on sort of meeting the requirements of any new reporting requirements. And there'll be as I say, a 3-year sort of transition program. We will be informing, I suppose, each of you over the 3 years where we might, start working with you and look to get you sort of reporting aligned with any new requirements. As I said, that I can't really say what the new requirements are because nothing's been decided yet. As I say, it's just in a consultation phase at the moment. But as I say, I'd recommend next week's webinar to you if you want to know more about it. Here's just a page of links to some of the documents I've mentioned. These links won't be live in this document, unfortunately. So if you can't find them by just going onto the ACFID website, I'm not too sure whether you can copy and paste out of here, but yeah, they should work if you copy those links and paste them into your browser. They should get to those particular documents. As I say, the last one there's that checklist I was talking about, and that's a pretty useful document for when you're doing annual reporting, just to make sure that you're complying with the requirements. And I would say one last chance for any questions at this stage. Nothing coming up. Okay. Our contact email. Yep, was on the. Actually, I'll just type it in. How's that? So if you think of anything after this, please let me know. Got my email now, and certainly got my phone number, so you know where I am. I work Mondays to Wednesdays, I should say. So Thursday to Friday, you won't be able to get hold of me, but yeah, I'll be there Monday to Wednesday most times. After we get out of this webinar presentation, you'll get a Survey Monkey that'll ask you a few questions about this presentation and also about other things you might be looking for. I'd like to thank you all for participating, and hopefully you got something out of it. I'd say this is the first time I've done a webinar from this end, so hopefully I wasn't too painful, and thanks for sticking with it. And look forward to working with you all in the future. Bye. And also, that country I had at the start was Samoa. So for those of you who might or might not have guessed. Okay, all the best. Thank you very much.